Hello everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending upon when you are listening to this audio lecture. In the earlier audio and video lectures, we discussed about some of the basic concepts of income tax and some of the definitions in the Income Tax Act. What are the various components of income tax law in India, and some terminology in relation to understanding of taxation in general, like tax, duty, cess, direct taxes, indirect taxes, etc. And very important definitions in the Income Tax Act, like SASI, person, India, assessment year, previous year, and what are the exceptions to the rules where normally income of an SSC pertaining to a previous year is subjected to tax in the assessment year, under what circumstances that general rule does not apply. All these aspects we discussed in the earlier classes as part of the first chapter, particularly if you look at the content of ICI material. And in some cases, we just discussed about the concept of the terms rather than going into the definitions. For example, income is a vast definition. We did not touch the definitions part, but we looked at what is the concept of income, what are the features of income. In general, how should we understand whenever income is a word used throughout this act, that we hopefully understood from that discussion what we had in the earlier chapter. Also, some of the concepts, though very specific in nature, but still which are important in theoretical case-based questions, like the concept of mutuality or the concept of incomes which are taxable at a higher rate because they were earlier undisclosed. So various cases related to section 68, 69, 69A, B, C, D, those incomes which are called undisclosed incomes or the incomes from unknown sources. So those are all the things which are not properly disclosed. In those cases, how such incomes are taxable, we have discussed all that as a part of discussion in first chapter of income tax material, particularly from an ICI material standpoint. And though as a step, it is the last step, but still we have already identified the provisions in relation to the computation of income tax after knowing the total income of an SSC. So there are certain provisions in the Income Tax Act also which are to be applied, something like section 288A and 288B related to rounding. Rebate is there under section 87A. These are all sections of the Income Tax Act which are useful in identifying certain calculational aspects. But the basic rates of tax which are all specified for the assessment year 2020-21 are mentioned in the Finance Act of 2019. So in the Finance Act of 2019, whatever the rates of tax are mentioned, those rates we have applied for the purpose of assessment year 2020-21. And we have done various types of exercises and practices wherein just calculating the base tax under normal circumstances was there, and calculating the tax liability of the individuals, particularly wherever there is rebate applicable under section 87A, computation of tax liability of individuals, especially when surcharge is applicable when they are earning higher amounts of incomes, and not only for individuals but also for other types of SSCs, how to calculate tax for firms, for companies, for cooperative societies, for LLPs, all those things we discussed, and we have practiced the applicational aspects of how these rates of tax have to be really used for computation of tax liability under different circumstances for different types of SSCs. With surcharge, without surcharge, with rebate, without rebate, different types of individuals, resident, non-resident, senior citizen, super senior citizen, in case of companies, domestic companies, foreign companies, even in case of domestic companies with turnover in the year 2017-18 more than 400 crores, and those companies where the turnover is less than 400 crores, Different permutations and combinations are there within which the computations will vary. When any particular fact changes, automatically the tax liability of that SSE also changes. And we applied all these things, and as a overall practice, most of you have done these things on paper and found the answers for computation of tax liability related questions. So that is a good experience in terms of computations what we all got in the rates of tax related topic. In addition to that, though as a sideline topic, but still a point which can be asked as a part of MCQ questions is marginal relief, and that concept also we discussed, under which circumstances that is available, and if it is available, how to calculate that stepwise. We tried and we practiced those questions also in the earlier classes. So with that, with the exception of some definitions which will be definitely discussed at a stage in future when they become easier to understand, except that the entire aspects related to chapter 1 of the ICA material we can conclude. Then we have to move to chapter 2, that is residential status and tax incidence. Scope of income, residential status, tax incidence, like that, these are all there, but basically residential status is what we are going to call this chapter as. But before entering into that, I would like to draw your attention to the steps involved in computation of tax liability and computation of total income of any SSE. In that, what are the steps? First step would be determination of residential status, then the heads of incomes will come, then the clubbing provisions, then the set of carry forward, then deductions, then we have total income. That total income on that tax liability will have to be calculated. So the last step is computation of tax liability actually, but we did it already. So we already did the climax before even knowing what is the movie. So we should know that because of the requirement we did that. Now actually speaking, the real process starts from residential status. So whatever the discussion happened so far, it is very important to create the ground for real process to be started, and that's what I have been doing, be it understanding the concepts and definitions, be it understanding the computation of tax liability of various types of SSEs. All this is a preparation of groundwork really for the purpose of entering into the real process of computation of total income. And as I generally give them as a comparison, this basic concepts, definitions, even residential status to some extent we can consider them or compare them like starter. So we are still in the starter. One starter is done, something like a soup is done. Now we have a snack along with that, that is residential status, but this is also a starter. The real main course is heads of incomes, that will come later. But definitely before going into that level of heads of incomes, as a matter of process of computation of total income, the first step is always determination of residential status. Then a question comes naturally, why is so? Why is determination of residential status is the first step? Why should we determine the residential status of any SSE? Why is that required? Answer is this. First of all, the residential status of any SSE is important to determine the tax incidence. So residential status is not some standalone computation which is just determined and left. No. The residential status, whatever we determine, that will be useful for identifying whether tax incidence is there on this SSE or not. So residential status and tax incidence go hand in hand. They cannot be separated. Tax incidence happens on the basis of residential status. Determination of residential status is important in order to identify the tax incidence. So these two are combined with each other. That is the first point to note while we understand various provisions in relation to this particular chapter. Then naturally a question comes, what are these words? Words are there. Residential status is one word we are using. Tax incidence is another word that we are using. So what are these words indicating? What are they indicating? Let us understand first, what does residential status mean? Residential status, as the name indicates, it is the status of an SSE in relation to a particular previous year. And that status is not that of a citizen. The status is not that of a rights of a person in terms of any country. The status is related to what? The residence. Only residence of a person is determined by residential status. So, nobody is giving any residential status to somebody. We have to understand that. Income tax law or we do not have any power or any kind of authority to give any residential status to anybody. They already have something. What we are trying to do is determine that what is their residential status. Everybody has a residential status automatically. But what is that residential status? We need to determine. How do we determine? That's what the provisions of this chapter are going to tell us. So that is residential status. In general, we need to remember these words because these words are going to be very useful and important in this entire chapter. In general, the residential status of individuals or HUF can be classified into three categories. Residential status of individuals and HUF. HUF, we know that. What is that? Hindu Undivided Family. So, individuals or HUF residential status can be classified into three categories. What are those three categories? First category is resident and ordinarily resident. Second category is resident but not ordinarily resident. Third category is non-resident. So as the flow chart, if you go to the diagram of chapter overview, that tells us very clearly what residential status does individual or HUF have? What kind of residential status they can have? Will there be any possibility of something else? Maybe individual, maybe resident, may not be resident. Like that, can we create any residential statuses? Not possible. There are only three residential statuses which are possible according to section 6 of the Income Tax Act. 3 means 3 only. Not any one more is possible. We cannot create anything. Only three things which are possible as a residential status for an individual or HUF are: 1. Resident and ordinarily resident. 2. Resident but not ordinarily resident. In it use exactly the same words. In the first case it is resident and ordinarily resident. In the second case it is resident but not ordinarily resident. So first case it is and, second case it is but. Those have to be also used because the law has used it the same way. We cannot swap them or we cannot create our own names. Again, we have to remember we are dealing with a legal subject. New names cannot be created. Whatever the law uses, that only we need to use. So resident and ordinarily resident, resident but not ordinarily resident, both of them are under the category of resident only. But they have a different two segments within the category of resident. Then non-resident is the other category. So on a broader basis, there are three possibilities only for any individual or HUF to have their residential status. And we generally call these with abbreviations because every time we cannot use these words: resident and ordinarily resident, resident but not ordinarily resident, non-resident. Big words. We have to remember them definitely. But going forward, we are going to use them with acronyms. Like for example, wherever there is resident and ordinarily resident, we are going to use ROR. ROR means resident and ordinarily resident. Did the income tax give us this permission? Absolutely not. We are taking that for our convenience. In exam, should we write ROR and all this? No. In exam, we should write full words. PGBP, ROR, all these acronyms, whatever we are using are only for convenience. To save time, every time we are using those words, we don't have to use the full sentence. That is why we are just using them as a shortcut. Only for remembering, only for understanding, it's okay. But while writing in exam, you have to write full abbreviations but not acronyms. That is the point always to be kept in mind. So ROR is one residential status, which means resident and ordinarily resident. RNOR means resident but not ordinarily resident. Then we have NR means non-resident. These are the words we use, but basically you need to remember these are the three possibilities of residential statuses for any individual or HUF. Can anyone have more than one? Can anybody be ROR also, RNOR also? Not possible. Not possible. So anybody will have only one of them. Either somebody will be ROR or somebody will be RNOR or somebody will be NR. Not possible for one person to have more than one residential status. That is a common sense point we should understand. So, what is a person's residential status? In which of the three categories a person belongs to? That is what we should determine. That is the purpose of this particular chapter. But we are now knowing the names. What are we going to do? These are the words and the names we should first know. Then definitely when we discuss the real provisions, we will understand how to determine. Now what we are knowing is what. Then we will come to know how. Why is not some question, always will be there in the legal subjects. Why is a very important question in subjects like accounting and costing, but that cannot be always the question in the case of legal subjects, because the law is what we have to follow. Law will have some intention, law will have some logic, but not necessarily always, not necessarily for everything. So that is why. So what and how are more important here than why. Why will be automatically told to you wherever it is possible to be told. So basically what we are knowing now is what are the possibilities of residential statuses of any individual or HUF. Three options possible. 1 ROR, 2 RNOR, 3 NR. Any individual or HUF will be falling in any one of these categories. Dot. That is first point. Second point, what about other types of SSCs? Firm, LLP, AOP, BOI, company, local authority, blah, blah, blah. We have so many other types of SSCs. What about them? Will they also have three categories? Answer is no. All of them, other than individual and HUF, will have only two categories. Either they will become resident or they are non-resident. That's it. There is nothing in between. Nothing called ordinary, not ordinary. Such categorization does not exist for other types of SSCs. Such categorization exists only for individuals and HUF. So individuals and HUF can have three possible residential statuses. One of them only. One of the three will be their possibility. And those three are ROR, RNOR and NR. Whereas other kinds of SSCs other than individual and HUF will have only two possibilities, either resident or non-resident. That's all. Once again, how to determine? That is the provisions of section 6, which will tell us about how to calculate residential status of different types of SSCs. That is the scope of this chapter, and that is the content which we are going to learn as a subject matter of this chapter. Now that is residential status part. Residential status part will tell us what is the status of any SSC. So any SSC may have a status of either resident or non-resident. These two are common for all. Either somebody will be a resident or somebody will be a non-resident. If somebody is a non-resident, there ends the matter. You don't have to worry about anything else. But how about somebody is a resident? Then, if that somebody is an individual or HUF, we have to also check whether that somebody who is an individual or HUF is ordinarily resident or not ordinarily resident. If he is ordinarily resident, we call him ROR. If he is not ordinarily resident, we call them RNOR. And this checking, ordinary, not ordinarily, is not required for other types of SSCs who are not individuals or HUF. That is residential status in a nutshell. But how to determine this? That is what we are going to discuss in the next classes. But now what we know in this class, what are the possible residential statuses? 1, 2, 3, that's all. Nothing more possible for anybody. Now, next question comes, okay boss, we have residential status. So what? Then why is it useful? Why is it required? Why is it important? Why is it important? As we already used that word, basically it is important because residential status only will determine the tax incidence. In other words, that can be called as the scope of total income. Incidence of tax means whether tax incidence is going to happen on a person or not. That is determined by what? Residential status. Before going into the technicalities of it or the legal words related to that, let us just understand in a very generic manner. Imagine there is some person who is working in Paris, who is actually a German national, working in France, Paris, and earning some income in Paris because of that job, whatever he is doing. Yes, there is a person and there is some income he is getting. But the question comes, okay Baba, somebody earning income somewhere in the world, can Indian Income Tax Act have purview on that? So is India going to levy income tax on all the people of the world? Everybody, whoever earns income in the world, can Indian Income Tax Act 1961 levy income tax on them? Is it possible? Just ridiculous, not possible. Somebody who is a German earning some income in France will never come under the scope of Income Tax Act at all. In other words, what we can say there is no tax incidence on that person. Why is that, sir? Not because he is German, not because he is working in France, because according to Indian Income Tax Act definition, which we are going to see, he might be under the category of being a non-resident. So, Indian Income Tax Act itself will define its own scope. That is why scope of total income we call it. We will define our own scope where certain incomes will come under the purview of Income Tax Act, where certain incomes of certain persons do not come under the purview of Income Tax Act. If they come, of course there is tax incidence. If they don't come within the scope of Indian Income Tax Act, that means there is no tax incidence. And all this depends upon what? Not according to our whims and fancies. It all depends upon only one thing. That is residential status. So that is why for determining tax incidence, residential status becomes very crucial. Without determining residential status, tax incidence is not possible. So we cannot find out the scope of our income without knowing what is the residential status of the SSE and what is the nature of income of that SSE. That is what the scope of total income section 5 will tell us. Now, under what circumstances income received by ROR is taxable? Taxable in the sense comes under the scope of Indian Income Tax Act. Under what circumstances RNOR's income is also taxable in India? Under what circumstances it is not taxable in India or not coming under the scope of Indian Income Tax Act? For non-residents also certain incomes are taxable in India if they come under the scope of Indian Income Tax Act, and if they don't come under the scope of Indian Income Tax Act, then they are not taxable. So these all things will be determined. We are going to discuss these provisions of section 5, which tells us the scope of total income. The purpose you have to understand why we need to know the scope of total income, because without knowing the scope, there is no tax incidence. Without knowing the scope, we cannot understand whether a particular income in relation to a particular SSE is taxable in India or not. That is a question always will remain. We cannot say any income in the world for any person in the world will come under the purview of Income Tax Act. Not possible. We are only one country in this world. We are not world. So we cannot say that everybody's income in the world will come under the purview of Income Tax Act. So what we should do? What is our job? We need to draw a boundary. We need to draw a boundary and say that, boss, whichever income is earned within this boundary, whichever income is received within this boundary by whoever it may be, it is taxable definitely. Like that we can tell. Or somebody who is coming under our purview, like who is our resident, or we can say who is our resident and ordinarily resident, whatever income he receives anywhere in the world, he has to pay income tax in India. Like that we can tell. Because he is our resident, we have power on that person. We cannot have power on everybody else in the world. So there are two aspects here we need to understand. Very important point now. Two aspects. One is the SASI. SASI is one part. Second part is location. Location is another part. So, in order for an income to be taxable, both have to be checked. What is the residential status of an SASI? That has to be also checked. Where the income is earned, where the income is received, that also has to be checked. And what are the two important things in order to check both of them? Residential status and tax incidence. One is SASI himself, taking for example individual for convenience purposes. Second is location. Where is this guy? Residential status will be determined upon the location of that individual in the previous year for certain number of days. So how is this happening? We have to determine. We have to identify what is the residential status of such person. Once we determine the residential status, that will not stop there. It will help us in identifying the tax incidence. Means whether any type of income, that particular type of income earned by so and so SASI is taxable in India or not. See, every time we are not going to use the word tax incidence. Every time we are not going to use the word which comes under the purview of Indian Income Tax Act, or every time we are not going to use the word it comes within the scope of total income of an SASI. All these words we are not going to use. What is the meaning of all this in one letter, one word we are going to use is taxable. That's it. Taxable. When we say, means automatically, okay, there is one guy whose residential status we know, and that guy's income comes under the purview of Indian Income Tax Act, which means there is tax incidence in India, which means there is a scope of income within the scope of Income Tax Act 1961. All these things are conveyed by one word. Simply we say taxable. Without that, we cannot use the word taxable. In other words, if I ask a question for the same example, the German guy earning some income in France, is his income taxable? If that is a question, answer is no, it is not taxable, because we are talking about India only. Are we talking about whether it is taxable in France? No, that is none of our business. That French government will take care of. That is none of our business. Whenever we say taxable, not taxable, in which context we are talking? We are talking about Indian context. We are talking about Indian Income Tax Act 1961. So is it taxable? Answer is no, it is not taxable. Because that has nothing to do with India. So can we just come out with a logic of why is it not taxable or taxable? No. We have to use provisions of the law, not just logic, not just common sense, not just imagination. We have to use provisions of the law, which are mentioned in section 5 and section 6. Together, combinedly, we have to use them. Then only we will come to know, okay, first of all, what is the residential status of that person? Second, if this is the residential status of this person, and if this is the kind of income that person is earning, whether that income is taxable or not. Yes or no only will be there. So this chapter is definitely also involving some computations, no doubt about it. But computations are less. Actually, the application of provisions is more. And here, this entire chapter is like a flow chart. It's like yes or no. Yes, okay, do this. No, do something else. Like that. So, it will be easier to understand in a flow chart model whether a particular person's residential status is determined in one way. And once it is determined, how that residential status has to be used for the purpose of determining the tax incidence of the incomes which that person is earning. So these are the aspects of this chapter. Section 5 and section 6 will tell us. Of course, the possible residential statuses, as we already discussed, for individuals and HUFs, there is a possibility of 3 statuses: resident and ordinarily resident, resident but not ordinarily resident, and non-resident. Whereas for other types of SSEs, there are 2 possibilities only. That is, one is resident, second one is non-resident. Right? Now let us understand another conceptual aspect here before entering into the provisions of the Act. So the provisions of the Act definitely will be important to note, but before that, why residential status is important? If you go to the printed image which talks about the residential status as heading, the tax incidence of a person depends upon his residential status. So before taxing any person, his status under the income tax must be decided for that previous year. That is a point here to be noted in relation to residential status. So when the word residential status is used, why is it used? Because that determines the tax incidence. In order to know tax incidence, we need to know residential status. So that is why before taxing any person, his status should be known under the Income Tax Act. And which status? We are not talking about that social status and financial status. We are talking about residential status of that person for that previous year. That is an important point to note. Residential status is not a permanent status. Any person will not have same residential status year after year. Residential status changes every year. Not necessarily that a person will have same residential status every year. No. Residential status will be different, could be different from year to year also. That is why this has to be determined for every previous year. This has to be determined for every previous year. That is a point to be noted. Now there is always a general confusion, we can say, in relation to the words citizenship and residential status. Are they same? Very important aspect to note. In our earlier examples, we talked about a German national. So what is his citizenship? His citizenship is that of Germany. Does it tell us anything about the residential status of that person in India? No. If nothing is mentioned, we assume that he is not in India, he is somewhere else only, because in our example, he was working in France. We don't know any other details in that example. So naturally, he has no relation with India. However, if there are details available, then also can we say that this person is not at all resident? Is residential status depending upon the nationality of the person? Because he is German national, because he is working somewhere else outside India, just that fact, will it tell the residential status of that person? Answer is no, not possible. In order to determine the residential status of a person, particularly when we talk about individual, we need to know further details about that individual. Just by knowing the nationality, we cannot jump to conclusion what is the residential status of a person. Lot of Indian nationals who are citizens of India still could be non-residents in India. Under the provisions of Income Tax Act, the status of all those people could be non-residents. In other words, Indian nationals could be non-residents, quite possible. Foreign nationals could be residents, quite possible. In other words, in simple terms, what? Residential status and citizenship are not one and the same. They are completely different. Citizenship is a different thing and different concept. Residential status is a different concept. We don't actually care about citizenship unless the law asks us to do that. If the law says Indian citizen, then definitely that provision is applicable only to Indian citizen. But the law never said Indian citizen. If you remember the rates of tax provisions, for example, 87A is applicable. Did they say it is applicable to Indian citizen? Was that the word used? No. The word used there was resident individual. Resident is the word used, not citizen. Same way, if you look at the higher rates of slab applicable for 60 years plus and 80 years plus individuals, there also, what was the word used? Resident, but not Indian citizen. No, not necessarily that person is required to be Indian citizen, and not necessarily that Indian citizens will get that automatically irrespective of their residential status. No. So there is no citizenship at all which was involved there. It was all resident is the word used. Same way, companies also, domestic companies and foreign companies are the words used there. There also the nature of the companies has been given. The residential status of the companies could be altogether different. So the point to note is, when we use the word citizenship, citizenship is something only for individuals. Some company will not have any citizenship, or a firm will not have any citizenship. Citizenship is something which is given to an individual. In general, once again, not necessarily, but in general, a person, whichever country that person is born, he becomes a citizen of that country. In general, that is what citizenship generally means. But residential status is not that. Residential status is completely different, and residential status is only in relation to Income Tax Act 1961 and only in relation to the Indian context, and that too only for a particular year. That much is the narrow scope of residential status. Citizenship is a broader concept. Citizenship is giving a particular citizen of a country certain rights and responsibilities in relation to that country. So that is why there is a difference between citizenship and residential status we should observe. Go through the points which are given in the image sent to you. The term residential status is a specific term used only for deciding the tax liability. Means whether a particular income is subjected to tax on this person or not. That is, we can particularly call it as tax incidence. Better than tax liability, better to use the word tax incidence. So residential status is useful only for determining tax incidence. It is not useful for anything else. And it is different from citizenship, which is a broader term. Citizenship is definitely a broader term, and citizenship determines the fundamental rights of an individual in relation to a country to which he is a citizen. So, residential status and citizenship are not one and the same. And second point again, unlike residential status, citizenship does not change every year. Again, in general, nobody is going to change the citizenships just like that casually every year. Okay, this year this guy is Indian citizen. Next year he got bored with this, so he became American citizen. Next year he becomes a British citizen. Next year he becomes Australian citizen. Like that, no country is going to allow also. That is not possible. Yes, of course, there is a possibility that one citizen of a country, after following due course of law, due process of law of another country, can become the citizen of other country. That's a different story. Like that, there could be many people with different citizenships, though their origin of birth is different and their citizenship is different. Those are all quite possible. But in spite of all this, citizenship is in general permanent in nature. In general, once again, don't come with exceptions. Like somebody goes to America, after a few years he gets green card, after some few years he gets passport, he becomes citizen of America. So citizenship has changed now. Yes, changed. There is a process for that. Citizenship is not something that automatically comes to everybody in the world. So, following the due process of law, due course of law, somebody may obtain the citizenship of another country after already he is having the citizenship of one country. That shifting of citizenship from one country to another country is an option. It is a possibility. Not necessarily everybody does that. Very few people do that, and whoever do that, they will get the citizenship of the other country. A lot of people, even from India, migrate to like Australia, Canada, USA, UK, other European countries, and even Gulf countries. They go. However, in Gulf countries, in spite of many number of years you stay, there is not going to be any citizenship change going to happen there. So, citizenship cannot be awarded in general to many Indians in the Gulf countries. But there are some countries like Canada, Australia, where the citizenship will be awarded in a reasonably quicker manner. And some countries may take reasonably more time. America may take little more time. Some other country may not give at all. Some country may take 5 years, some country may take 40 years. So we don't care about all that. That is all about citizenship. Nothing to do with residential status. What is the citizenship of that person? We don't care. That is the personal problem of a particular individual. What is the citizenship? And what is our issue here in Income Tax Act is not citizenship. That is residential status. So this residential status might change very well every year also, quite possible. Citizenship might not change every year. Generally that is not possible. And residential status, it is quite possible. Again, we are saying that it is possible. We are not saying that it is going to happen like that. For all of you and for most of us, whoever is listening, the residential status is that of resident only. We are all basically Indian citizens. Most of the time we stay in India only. So naturally we are all resident and ordinary resident. Every year we don't change it. Not necessarily. So for many people it may not change it. But for some people it may change it also. So it may change the residential status every year also. But citizenship will not change every year. That is generally permanent. Though with one or two changes that might happen exceptionally in the lives of some extraordinary people. Very few people in the world. But residential status has nothing like that. This is possible, quite technically possible, that a person could be a resident this year and immediately in the next year he could be a non-resident, depending upon the conditions that he followed this year or did not follow in the next year. So the point to note is, once again, residential status and citizenship are different in nature. Citizenship is broader concept, is generally long-term permanent concept. Residential status is a shorter concept or means a narrow concept, and it has a very particular area of application called tax incidence. And citizenship is something which cannot be changed frequently. Residential status is something which might change frequently. And one more point here to note, residential status, somebody is not changing. Somebody is not going to tell, okay, from today I am becoming resident, from tomorrow I am becoming non-resident. Nothing like that. It is not a choice of a person. But it is determined according to the facts related to that person. So, residential status is determined. Citizenship is awarded. There is a difference between these two in that way also. Then, these two are conceptually different, definitely from each other. An SASI being a resident in India may not be a citizen of India. Not necessarily all residents of India should be citizens of India. Not necessarily. So, a person may be a resident in India, but still he may not be a citizen of India. On the other side, there could be a person who is a citizen of India who may not be a resident in India. Means what? He might be a non-resident as per the definition of Income Tax Act. And now there are certain points to be noted here where we loosely use these words NRI. NRI means non-resident Indian. Do we use that word here? Generally no. We use the word non-resident dot, not NRI. We don't care about non-resident Indian. As far as Income Tax Act is concerned, the word used is non-resident. That's all. So whoever is a non-resident, those are all non-residents in India. Non-residents in India means what? They are not in India. In our example, for example, where we have taken that German national staying in France, he is also a non-resident only, but he is not NRI. So we use this NRI word so frequently in general colloquial usage, not to be used for income tax purposes. That is what I mean to say. NRI in general sense is used in what way? Person who is basically an Indian citizen, but who is not staying in India, who is outside India, is called an NRI. They don't calculate number of days and all. That is not a status given by law. NRI is a usage word. Somebody gets a job and just goes out of the country to do that job, we call him NRI. We don't care about where is he working, how many days he has been there outside India, all those things we don't care. So that is usage word, NRI, which is not a legal word. What is a legal word? What is the word we have to use? We should not use the word NRI anywhere. We have to use the word non-resident. That's all. And we have to be very clear, wherever we are using these words, we have to be very clear that citizenship and residential status are not same. Resident is different, citizen is different. Non-resident is different, non-citizen is different. So both are not one and the same. This clarity should be there in relation to various terms which are all mentioned in this particular chapter. That is the essence of the residential status and tax incidence, where a person's residential status will be determined depending upon various conditions. What are the possibilities? ROR, RNOR, and NR. That is for individuals. For all others, resident, non-resident. So that is residential status. Then why that will be useful? Once residential status is determined, that helps in determining tax incidence, whether a particular income earned by that particular person comes under the purview of Income Tax Act or not. That we simply say yes or no. In other words, simply we say taxable, not taxable. Taxable means comes within the scope. Not taxable means does not come within the scope of income under Income Tax Act. These two things are all specified in section 5, that is scope of total income, section 6, that is determination of residential status. Both of them put together are the subject matter of this particular chapter. We will enter into the provisions in relation to determination of residential status, particularly in relation to individuals to start with. Then we will move on to some other types of SSCs also, how to determine the residential status first. Then the second portion, second half or second part of this chapter will be how the residential status helps us in determining tax incidence. That is the scope of this chapter. We can say the introduction to residential status chapter is finished. In the next class, we will discuss about the provisions in relation to computation of number of days of stay in India, which is very useful for determination of residential status of individuals, and determine the residential status itself, then determine the tax incidence also. All these things we will continue in the upcoming classes, and we can conclude today's introductory session with that. Until we meet in the next class, take care, stay home, stay safe. Thank you very much. Bye.